Picture this. You are standing in the smouldering ruins of Moscow in 1571. The air is thick, choking your lungs with the stench of melting flesh and burning timber. You cannot see the sun. It is blocked out by a massive canopy of black smoke stretching for miles. Beneath your boots, the ground is literally hot to the touch. The Moskva River is choked with corpses, thousands of people who tried to escape the flames, only to boil alive in the shallow water. You are a survivor of one of the most complete annihilations of a capital city in human history. The Crimean Khanate has just swept through, leaving behind nothing but charred bones and taking 150,000 of your people in chains to be sold in the flesh markets of Kaffa. You look at the ashes of what used to be a burgeoning empire and you realize something terrifying. The Tatars are not finished. They are coming back next year. And next time, they will not just burn the city, they will erase Russia from the map. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. By 1572, the Russian Tsardom is a bleeding carcass waiting for the vultures. Ivan the Terrible, the ruthless tyrant who supposedly ruled this freezing expanse, has fled his own capital and is hiding in the north. He is broken, paranoid, and utterly powerless to stop the storm gathering in the south. The Crimean Khan Devlet Giray is not just a raider looking for winter loot. He is the apex predator of the steppes, backed by the immense geopolitical muscle of the Ottoman Empire, and he smells blood in the water. He has mobilized an apocalyptic force of 120,000 men. This is not an army. It is a migration of death. It includes the finest elite Tatar horsemen, battle-hardened Ottoman janissaries carrying deadly matchlock muskets, and heavy siege artillery dragged across the endless plains. Their objective is chillingly simple. They are not coming to negotiate treaties. They are coming to exterminate the Russian state and turn its vast forests into hunting grounds. Devlet Giray is so confident in his impending victory that he has already assigned Russian cities to his generals as future estates. Russia is entirely bankrupt. The disastrous Livonian War in the West has drained their treasury and chewed up their best professional soldiers in meaningless sieges. Plagues and famines have severely ravaged the countryside, leaving ghost towns in their wake. When the desperate call to arms goes out to defend the motherland from total extinction, the response is pitiful. The Russian military apparatus manages to scrape together a miserable 23,000 men. They are a ragtag assortment of border guards, Streltsy infantrymen, a handful of German mercenaries, and exhausted noble cavalry. They are outnumbered more than 5 to 1. Mathematics dictates that they are already dead. Every royal court in Western Europe has already written the obituary for the Russian state. The foreign ambassadors in Istanbul are already discussing how to carve up the massive territory once the Khan hands the keys of Moscow to the Ottoman Sultan. But the Khan makes a fatal miscalculation. He assumes that a dying animal has no teeth. He expects the Russians to cower behind whatever wooden walls they have left and wait to be slaughtered like sheep. He does not understand the brutal, cornered rat psychology of a people who have already seen hell and decided they would rather drag their enemies into the abyss with them than be put in chains. The men marching south to meet the Tatar horde know they are not fighting for a cowardly Tsar or a flag. They are fighting for the sheer biological survival of their bloodlines. They are walking straight into a meat grinder, and they are fully prepared to jam the gears with their own bones. The stage is set on the muddy banks of the Pakra River, near a completely unremarkable village called Molodi. And what is about to happen there will permanently alter the balance of power on the Eurasian continent. To understand the sheer scale of the nightmare descending upon the Russian border, you have to forget everything you know about traditional European warfare. The Crimean Tatar army of 1572 is not a column of neatly dressed soldiers marching in a straight line. It is a biological weapon. It is a sprawling, chaotic organism of 120,000 men and perhaps 300,000 horses moving across the steppe like a shadow blocking out the sun. When this horde moves, the vibration of millions of hooves creates a low, rumbling earthquake that can be felt miles away before a single rider is even visible. The dust cloud they kick up turns the midday sky into a choking, twilight haze. But this is the steppe's final roar, a massive, muscular spasm of the old Mongol way of war, terrifyingly updated with Ottoman firepower. At the head of this apocalypse rides Devlet Giray. He does not view Ivan the Terrible as a rival monarch. He views him as a disobedient vassal, a rebellious dog that needs to be put down. The Khan's confidence is not just arrogance. It is backed by a horrifying track record. Just 1 year prior, his light cavalry had effortlessly bypassed the Russian southern defenses, casually riding up to the gates of Moscow and turning the city into a crematorium. Now he has returned to finish the job, and this time he has brought the heavy machinery. Alongside his endless swarms of horse archers, the Khan commands thousands of elite Ottoman janissaries. These are not tribal raiders. They are highly disciplined, salaried killers wielding heavy matchlock muskets, marching alongside roaring siege cannons designed to pulverize whatever stone or timber the Russians try to hide behind. The psychological terror of facing this combined force is paralyzing. The Tatars bring massive war drums that beat relentlessly through the night, a rhythmic pounding designed to shatter the nerves of anyone waiting in the dark. The plan is a wholesale liquidation of the Russian state. Devlet Giray intends to execute the Tsar, install a puppet governor, and absorb the entire landmass into his empire. He has already issued orders on how the remaining Russian population will be harvested. The strong men will be chained to the oars of Ottoman galleys, rowing until their hearts burst in their chests from exhaustion. The women and children will flood the slave markets of Kaffa and Istanbul, driving down the price of human flesh to practically nothing. The Khan intends to turn the grand churches of the north into stables for his horses and erase the very concept of a Russian nation from the history books. Standing in the path of this continent-shattering force is a Russian army that looks like a morbid joke. They number barely 23,000 men. They are chronically underfed, severely underpaid, and exhausted from years of endless frontier skirmishes. Their armor is patched, their weapons are a miserable mix of outdated polearms, heavy axes, and whatever firearms they could scrounge from the royal armories. They are strung out along the banks of the Oka River, trying to guard a front that is impossibly wide. The mathematics of the situation are completely absurd. Every single Russian soldier is expected to kill at least 5 hardened steppe warriors just to break even. In a straight fight on an open field, this small defensive force would be enveloped and butchered in less than an hour. But starvation and desperation have a strange effect on the human mind. The Russian soldiers freezing in the mud along the Oka River know exactly what happened to Moscow the previous year. They all have family members who were either burned alive or dragged off with iron collars around their necks. They are devoid of any romantic illusions about glory or honor. There are no trumpets sounding or bards singing songs of their bravery. There is only the grim, freezing reality that they are the final fleshy barricade between their families and the slave whips of the Khanate. They are not preparing for a traditional battle. They are preparing to inflict as much agonizing physical pain as possible before they are hacked to pieces. The Russians dig into the earth, sharpen their stakes, and wait for the ground to start shaking. And as the immense shadow of the Tatar horde finally crests the southern horizon, the air grows dead silent. The waiting is over, the butchers have arrived, and the slaughter is about to begin. The man tasked with stopping this apocalyptic tide is Prince Mikhail Vorotynsky. To call him a general is an understatement. He is a walking phantom, a scarred survivor who has already looked the devil in the eye and lived to tell the tale. Years before this campaign, his employer, the famously paranoid Tsar Ivan the Terrible, decided Vorotynsky was a threat. Ivan did not simply relieve his top commander of duty. He had Vorotynsky strapped to a wooden stake and personally raked glowing coals over his bare feet, watching the flesh blacken and blister in the royal torture chambers. Vorotynsky miraculously survived the agony, was stripped of his titles, and banished to a freezing, miserable exile. Now, with the capital reduced to cinders and the Tsar fleeing like a coward to a fortified estate in the far north, the panicked crown has dragged its crippled general out of the dark. Ivan hands the man he tortured a fractured, starving army and orders him to halt a force that outnumbers him 5-1. It is the ultimate suicide mission, a convenient way for the Tsar to dispose of a threat and buy himself a few extra days to run. Vorotynsky accepts the command. He does not do this out of some misplaced loyalty to a tyrant who burned his flesh. He does it because he understands the grim, undeniable mathematics of the steppe. He knows that if Devlet Giray successfully crosses the Oka River and secures a foothold, the very concept of the Russian nation will be extinguished forever. The Slavic people will be reduced to livestock, bred only for the slave markets of the Ottoman Empire. Vorotynsky rides south on ruined feet that still scream in pain with every step. He arrives at the front lines and surveys his pathetic excuse for a military force. He sees 23,000 exhausted border guards, underpaid German mercenaries, and grim-faced Streltsy musketeers. They are shivering in the damp cold, their bellies empty, holding rusted halberds and heavy matchlocks. Vorotynsky does not insult their intelligence with a rousing speech about honor or glory. There is no glory waiting for them in the mud of Molodi. He looks at his men and they look back at a commander who is as dead inside as they are. They share the silent, terrifying understanding that they are nothing more than a fleshy speed bump. In a conventional military engagement on the open plains, the Tatar cavalry will simply encircle them, blot out the sun with 1,000,000 arrows, and butcher every single man before the sun reaches its peak. Vorotynsky knows that fighting the Khan on his own terms is a guaranteed death sentence. The rule book of medieval warfare dictates that they should surrender or flee. But a man who has had his feet roasted over an open fire by his own king no longer plays by the rules. Vorotynsky decides that if he cannot beat the steppe riders in a game of speed, he will force them to fight a war of absolute, grinding attrition. He will turn the boundless open field into a claustrophobic slaughterhouse. He recognizes a fatal psychological flaw in the enemy. The Tatar horde, for all its terrifying momentum and apocalyptic size, is incredibly arrogant. They are accustomed to dealing with victims who scatter and run. They have never faced prey that violently refuses to die. Vorotynsky needs a mechanical equalizer, something capable of neutralizing the overwhelming kinetic energy of over 100,000 charging horses. A stationary stone castle is utterly useless against a highly mobile enemy that can simply bypass it and pillage the interior. He needs a fortress that can march alongside his doomed men. He needs to build a trap so massive and so deadly that the arrogant Khan will not be able to resist stepping into it. As he watches the dust cloud of the enemy approaching, Vorotynsky begins to lay the groundwork for a masterclass in asymmetrical slaughter, preparing to feed the greatest cavalry force on earth directly into a wood and iron meat grinder. To survive an open-field encounter against 100,000 steppe riders, you have to fundamentally understand the physics of cavalry. A horse is not just an animal. In the 16th century, a charging war horse is a 1,000-pound biological missile. It carries kinetic energy that shatters bones before a sword is even swung. For 300 years, the golden rule of surviving a Mongol or Tatar assault was simple. You hide behind massive stone walls or you die. But Prince Vorotynsky does not have stone walls. He has a few open fields, a lot of mud, and an army that is already half-starved. So he decides to build a wall that can walk. This is the gulyay gorod, literally translated as the wandering city. It sounds like an elegant piece of fantasy engineering, but the physical reality is ugly, heavy, and brutally practical. It is a massive modular fortress made of thick oak shields, prefabricated and mounted on heavy wooden wagons. These are not flimsy barricades. The wood is cut specifically thick enough to absorb the armor-piercing impact of a composite bow at close range. When the army stops marching, these wagons are quickly dragged into a massive geometric formation, usually a circle or a sprawling crescent, and then physically chained together with heavy iron links. Within minutes, an empty, grassy plain is transformed into a fortified wooden castle. Behind these heavy oak planks, Vorotynsky places his killing engines. He lines up the streltsy, the Russian musketeers, wielding heavy, slow-firing matchlocks. He positions German mercenaries operating light field artillery loaded with grape shot. Slits are cut into the wood, creating thousands of tiny murder holes. The genius of the gulyay gorod is not in its architecture. It is in how it completely violently breaks the rules of steppe warfare. The Tatar war machine relies entirely on fluid momentum. They swarm, they fire 1,000 arrows, they feign retreat, and they pull you out of formation until you are exhausted. Then they ride you down. The wandering city completely neutralizes this tactic because it refuses to move. Vorotynsky is forcing a software update on medieval combat. He is essentially telling the Khan that he will not play a game of maneuverability. He has parked a heavily armed wooden meat grinder in the middle of the Russian highway, and if the Khan wants to burn Moscow again, he is going to have to physically chew his way through it. It is a brilliant psychological trap, perfectly calibrated to exploit the arrogance of the enemy. If Devlet Giray ignores the wooden fortress and marches north, Vorotynsky will simply unchain the wagons, follow his rear guard, and shoot his supply lines to pieces. If the Khan stops to attack it, he is forcing his light cavalry to charge into a stationary wall that spits fire and lead. It is a geographical chokehold. Vorotynsky strategically parks this monstrosity near the village of Molodi, anchoring its flanks to a hill and a shallow river. He takes the infinite, terrifying expanse of the Russian steppe and artificially shrinks it into a claustrophobic kill zone. Inside the wooden walls, the atmosphere is suffocating. The Russian soldiers are packed in shoulder to shoulder. The smell of raw earth, cheap black powder, and nervous sweat hangs heavy in the air. The men gripping their muskets know the terrifying reality of their situation. The gulyay gorod is a phenomenal defensive weapon, but it is also a cage. If the iron chains holding the wagons together snap, or if the sheer weight of 100,000 charging horses tips the carts over, there is no escape. The horde will flood through the breach, and everyone inside will be hacked to pieces in minutes. They are locked inside their own trap, completely dependent on the wood holding firm. But a trap is completely useless if the prey refuses to step into it. Vorotynsky knows that the Khan is a veteran commander. Devlet Giray is not going to just throw his precious cavalry at a fortified position for no reason. He needs to be provoked. He needs to be made so irrationally angry, so completely blinded by rage and insulted pride, that he abandons his tactical discipline and charges into the wood chipper. To trigger this blinding rage, Vorotynsky realizes he has to offer the Khan a piece of bait. He needs to send a small group of his own men on a suicide mission to kick the sleeping dragon directly in the teeth. The Russian High Command knows that a trap is only a collection of wood and iron until the prey actually steps into it. Devlet Giray is an apex predator, but he is not an idiot. His massive army has actually already crossed the Oka River and is streaming northward toward Moscow, completely ignoring the pathetic Russian force digging in at Molodi. The Khan's logic is cold and sound. Why bother fighting a starving garrison when you can just bypass them and burn the capital again? Vorotynsky realizes he is watching his entire country slip through his fingers. He has built the ultimate meat grinder, but the butcher is walking right past it. To fix this, Vorotynsky needs to commit an act of spectacular, suicidal annoyance. He summons Prince Dmitry Khvorostinin, a cavalry commander with a reputation for reckless aggression, and hands him the worst job in the history of medieval warfare. Khvorostinin is given a detachment of fast, lightly armored cavalry. His orders are not to win a battle. His orders are to ride directly into the rear guard of a 120,000-man horde, punch them in the mouth, and then run away, screaming. It is a textbook feigned retreat, the oldest trick in the steppe warfare playbook, but this time it is being played against the absolute masters of the game. Khvorostinin and his men ride out into the dust. They know exactly what this is. They are the blood bait. You have to imagine the sheer stomach-churning terror of this assignment. You are riding towards a dust cloud that stretches from horizon to horizon. You can hear the thundering of tens of thousands of hooves before you can even see the enemy riders. When the Russian cavalry finally catches up to the tail end of the Tatar migration, they do not hesitate. They smash into the unsuspecting rear guard with terrifying, desperate violence. Sabers hack into flesh, horses collide in bone-shattering impacts, and the Russian riders scream insults specifically meant to humiliate the proud steppe warriors. For a brief, chaotic moment, the Russians actually cause a panic. But a localized panic in an army of this size is like a mosquito bite on an elephant. Within minutes, the Tatar commanders realize what is happening. The sheer insult of it is intoxicating. A miserable, starving band of Russian stragglers has the absolute audacity to attack the rear of the invincible Khanate. The Tatar rear guard, numbering in the tens of thousands, immediately wheels around. They do not wait for orders from the Khan. They are driven by pure, unadulterated pride and the instinctual urge to crush this pathetic annoyance. This is exactly what Khvorostinin wants, and it is the most terrifying moment of his life. The second the Tatars turn, the Russian commander signals the retreat. The bait has been taken. Now, they just have to survive the sprint back to the cage. What follows is a high-speed, agonizing chase across the flat Russian plains. The Russian horses are foaming at the mouth, their lungs burning, pushed to the absolute brink of heart failure. Right behind them, a tidal wave of Tatar light cavalry is closing the distance. The air is filled with the shrieking whistle of steppe arrows and the terrifying guttural war cries of men who have been promised the wealth of an empire. Russian riders are picked off one by one, tumbling from their saddles into the crushing wave of hooves behind them. There is no time to mourn, no time to look back. Khvorostinin is not just running blindly, he is threading a needle. He has to keep the Tatars enraged enough to keep chasing, but he cannot let them catch him. He leads this apocalyptic swarm of angry horsemen directly toward the gentle slopes of Molodi. The Tatar vanguard is practically frothing at the mouth, their eyes fixed solely on the fleeing Russians. They are so consumed by the thrill of the chase that they do not look at the terrain. They do not notice the unnatural geometric shape sitting quietly in the middle of the field ahead. They do not see the thousands of matchlock muskets resting silently in the wooden murder holes. Khvorostinin's surviving riders violently yank their reins, tearing their horses through a narrow, pre-planned gap in the heavy oak wagons. The bait is safely inside, and the massive, unstoppable kinetic wave of the Tatar cavalry is charging at full speed into a solid wooden wall. The sheer momentum of a massive cavalry charge is its greatest weapon, but it is also a fatal physical flaw. Once tens of thousands of horses are sprinting at full speed, they cannot simply hit the brakes. The front ranks of the Tatar vanguard realize a fraction of a second too late that their fleeing Russian prey has vanished. They have darted through a narrow, prearranged gap in a solid wall of thick oak shields. The riders in the very front pull desperately on their reins, trying to turn, trying to halt their massive war horses, but it is physically impossible. They are instantly crushed from behind, pulverized by the unstoppable tidal wave of their own men crashing into their backs. The collision is deafening. Thousands of 1,000-pound animals slam into the gulyay gorod with the kinetic force of a localized earthquake. The thick wooden wagon boards splinter and groan. The heavy iron chains binding the fortress together scream under the immense pressure. Horses snap their necks against the timber, and riders are catapulted over the barricades into the dirt. For a terrifying few seconds, the Russian defenders inside the wooden box wonder if the sheer weight of the horde will flip the wagons entirely. But the heavy chains hold. The wandering city absorbs the impact, and then the wooden wall breathes fire. Prince Vorotynsky gives the order at point-blank range. Thousands of Russian streltsy waiting in the suffocating, powder-choked dark behind narrow murder holes pull the glowing matches of their heavy muskets. The entire perimeter of the gulyay gorod erupts in a blinding, synchronized sheet of flame. At this microscopic distance, the German mercenaries manning the field artillery do not even need to aim. They are firing grape shot, which are essentially canvas bags packed with rusted nails, lead balls, and jagged iron scrap, directly into a densely packed wall of horseflesh and human bodies. The immediate result is not a military engagement, it is industrial butchery. The heavy matchlock lead balls punch through the light leather armor of the steppe riders as if it were wet paper, shattering ribs and tearing off limbs. The artillery grapeshot acts like a giant, invisible scythe, instantly turning hundreds of elite Tatar horsemen into an unrecognizable mist of blood, bone, and screaming animals. The entire front line of the horde is practically vaporized in the first deafening volley. But the true horror of Vorotynsky's trap is that the horde cannot retreat. The tens of thousands of riders in the back of the charge cannot see the slaughter at the front. They are completely blinded by the massive dust cloud they themselves have kicked up. They hear the thunder of the cannons, but in the chaos, they assume it is their own siege engines arriving, or simply the loud, violent sounds of a Russian collapse. So they keep charging. They whip their horses, pushing violently forward into the meat grinder. They are literally trampling over the violently thrashing, bleeding bodies of their dying comrades just to reach the wooden wall, only to be met by the second devastating volley of Russian gunfire. The gulyay gorod becomes a black hole of death, sucking the greatest cavalry force on the planet into a tiny, highly localized slaughterhouse. The steppe warriors, men who were born in the saddle and trained to conquer empires with mobility and composite bows, are completely impotent. They are shooting arrows at thick oak planks. They are hacking at solid wood with curved sabers. It is an exercise in absolute humiliating futility. For hours, wave after wave of Tatar cavalry washes against the wandering city, and every single wave is turned into a red smear on the muddy grass. By the time the sun begins to set, the physical geography of the battlefield has changed. The gulyay gorod is no longer surrounded by flat steppe. It is surrounded by a massive, groaning moat of dead horses and dying men, a rampart of flesh piled so incredibly high that in some places the newly arriving Tatars are forced to use the corpses of their brothers as ramps to try and jump over the wooden shields. When the news of the vanguard's annihilation finally reaches Devlet Giray at his command tent miles away, the Khan is paralyzed by a terrifying realization. He has not just lost a skirmish, he has been outsmarted by a ghost. He has been dragged into a claustrophobic street fight by a crippled Russian general who has somehow managed to put the boundless, infinite steppe inside a wooden box. The adrenaline of surviving the initial collision quickly evaporates, leaving behind a reality that is infinitely worse than a quick death in battle. The gulyay gorod has successfully stopped the Tatar momentum, but in doing so, Prince Vorotynsky has essentially locked his own men inside a wooden coffin. It is late July on the Russian steppe. The sun beats down with a suffocating, relentless heat, turning the inside of the wandering city into a giant, suffocating oven. The 23,000 Russian defenders are crammed together shoulder to shoulder in a space designed for a fraction of that number. There is no sanitation, there is no shade, and worst of all, there is no escape. Outside the heavy oak walls, the psychological torture is constant. The Tatar horde, realizing that a direct cavalry charge is suicidal, resorts to what they do best: terror. Day and night they unleash a ceaseless rain of arrows that arc high into the sky and drop vertically into the packed Russian formation. Men are pinned to the earth while they sleep, but the arrows are nothing compared to the drums. Massive war drums pound endlessly through the darkness, a heavy, rhythmic thudding designed to mimic a terrifying heartbeat, ensuring that the exhausted Russians never get a single moment of peace. It is a calculated effort to snap their minds before breaking their bodies. But the true killer inside the wooden walls is not Tatar steel, it is thirst. The gulyay gorod is positioned near a small river, but stepping outside the barricades to fetch water is an absolute death sentence. Tatar archers have the banks perfectly sighted. Anyone who makes a run for the river is immediately turned into a pincushion. Within 2 days, the water reserves inside the fort are completely bone dry. The heat intensifies, men begin to hallucinate. Driven by the agonizing scrape of a dry throat, Russian soldiers drop to their knees and use their bare, bloody hands to dig desperately into the trampled earth, searching for groundwater. They find nothing but mud mixed with the blood, feces, and urine of their own army. They literally suck the moisture out of the filthy dirt just to keep their tongues from swelling in their mouths. Food becomes an equally horrifying nightmare. The supply wagons are empty. The only protein available comes from the warhorses that were killed in the initial barrage. Lighting a fire to cook the meat is impossible. A spark could ignite the wooden shields, burning the entire fortress down around them, and the smoke would act as a perfect target for enemy artillery. So the men eat the horses raw. They carve bloody chunks of meat from the rotting carcasses and chew on them in the sweltering heat. The German mercenaries, men who fought for coin, now realize no amount of silver is worth this hell. The stench of 23,000 unwashed, starving men mixed with the rotting mountain of Tatar corpses baking in the sun just outside the walls creates a biological hazard so thick it burns the lungs. Black swarms of flies coat every surface, laying eggs in the wounds of the living. Yet, as agonizing as it is for the Russians, Vorotynsky knows a crucial, stabilizing secret. The Khan is bleeding out too. You cannot park 120,000 men and 300,000 horses in one spot for very long without completely devastating the local ecosystem. The massive Tatar horde is drinking the surrounding streams dry and grazing the steppe down to bare dirt. Without fresh grass, the legendary Tatar horses begin to weaken and die. Disease is beginning to ripple through the enemy encampment as the sanitary conditions of 100,000 stationary men rapidly deteriorate. Devlet Giray is running out of supplies, running out of resources, and most importantly, running out of time. Every single day the Khan spends staring at this wooden box is a day he is not burning Moscow. The embarrassment of the situation is eating him alive. He is the undisputed master of the Eurasian steppe, the man who terrified empires, and he is being humiliated by a crippled Russian general hiding behind a pile of wooden carts. The siege of the wood becomes a grotesque staring contest, a pure, unadulterated test of biological endurance to see which army will literally eat itself to death first. Both sides are pushed to the absolute ragged edge of human sanity, waiting for the other to crack. And in this crucible of starvation and pride, someone is bound to make a fatal mistake. To truly grasp the magnitude of the disaster that is about to unfold, you have to step inside the mind of a 16th century steppe warrior. For a Tatar cavalryman, his horse is not just a vehicle or a tool of war, it is his entire identity. It is his social status, his primary weapon, and his heritage. A man on horseback is a conqueror, an apex predator who rides above the dirt of the peasantry. To order such a man to dismount in the middle of a battle is not merely a change in tactics, it is an extreme psychological humiliation. It strips him of his nobility and reduces him to the level of the very people he is actively trying to enslave. Devlet Giray, the Khan of the Crimea, is fully aware of this deep cultural taboo. But the Khan is no longer thinking like a brilliant tactician. He is thinking like a desperate politician who is watching his legacy bleed to death in the mud. He has spent days throwing thousands of men at a makeshift wooden box, and he has absolutely nothing to show for it but a mountain of rotting corpses. His water supplies are practically gone. His legendary horses are dying of starvation and disease, and worst of all, the terrifying aura of invincibility that the steppe horde has enjoyed for centuries is evaporating right in front of his eyes. If he orders a strategic retreat now, he will be laughed out of his own court. He might even face a rebellion from his own generals. His own monumental arrogance has trapped him just as effectively as Vorotynsky's wooden walls have trapped the Russians. So, in a blind fit of furious pride, the Khan issues an order that permanently shatters the military doctrine of the Mongol Empire. He commands his elite heavy cavalry, his personal guard, and the Ottoman janissaries to dismount. He orders them to march up to the gulyay gorod on foot, grab the thick oak shields with their bare hands, and physically tear the wandering city apart. Imagine the utter disbelief rippling through the Tatar ranks. These are aristocratic men who conquered continents from the saddle, now being told to trudge through the blood-soaked mud like common laborers. But the Khan's word is absolute law. Thousands of the finest horsemen in the world reluctantly slide down from their saddles. They draw their curved sabers, weapons specifically designed for slashing downward at a full gallop, and begin to awkwardly trudge toward the fortified Russian position. From inside the suffocating sun-baked oven of the gulyay gorod, the exhausted Russian defenders look through their murder holes and cannot believe what they are seeing. The terrifying, fast-moving biological machine that has tormented them for days has voluntarily broken itself. The horde is moving at a slow, agonizing walking pace. Prince Vorotynsky watches this desperate, unnatural infantry march and realizes he has finally broken the mind of the enemy. The Khan has voluntarily traded his only tactical advantage, his overwhelming kinetic speed, for a suicidal shoving match in the dirt. When the dismounted Tatars finally reach the wooden shields, it ceases to be a battle and rapidly devolves into a desperate, chaotic riot. The steppe warriors try to climb the smooth oak planks with heavy boots. They try to hack through the thick timber with lightweight cavalry swords, which immediately chip and shatter against the solid wood. The Russian streltsy, no longer having to track fast-moving targets, simply press the muzzles of their heavy matchlocks directly against the chests of the men outside and pull the triggers. At zero range, the heavy lead balls pulverize the unarmored Tatars, blowing massive holes through their tightly packed ranks. The attackers who manage to grab the top of the wooden barricades with their bare, bleeding hands are immediately met with heavy Russian axes and rusted halberds, chopping off fingers and splitting skulls. The great Tatar warriors, the nightmare of Eastern Europe, are dying on their knees in the mud. They are crying out in frustration, butchered like the very peasants they despise. It is a spectacular, humiliating failure of leadership. Devlet Giray has successfully turned his invincible cavalry into the worst infantry on the planet. And in doing so, he has unknowingly set the stage for his own absolute annihilation. The Tatar army is entirely consumed by the bloody geometry of the wooden wall. They are deafened by the roar of Russian matchlocks and blinded by the thick, choking clouds of black powder smoke hanging in the stagnant summer air. They do not realize that their absolute fixation on the gulyay gorod has made them blind to the rest of the world. They have pinned themselves against the anvil. Now Prince Vorotynsky is preparing the hammer. Inside the suffocating wooden fortress, Vorotynsky knows that his men are seconds away from complete biological collapse. They have no water, no food, and their musket barrels are glowing red-hot, literally melting from the sustained rate of fire. The barricades are groaning under the immense, crushing weight of tens of thousands of dismounted steppe warriors pressing against them. The Russian general realizes that if he waits for the Tatars to simply give up, his own defenses will shatter first. It is time to execute the final fatal stroke of his masterpiece. Leaving Prince Khvorostinin in command of the heavy artillery and the streltsy at the front, Vorotynsky quietly gathers a hidden reserve force of cavalry. While the horde is violently occupied trying to tear the front doors off the wandering city, Vorotynsky slips his riders out through a narrow opening in the rear. He leads them down into a shallow, dry river ravine that wraps entirely around the battlefield. The geography of Molodi, the very dirt that the Khan so arrogantly ignored, is about to become his tomb. The Russian cavalry moves in complete silence, masked by the deafening roar of the siege. They ride in a wide arc, completely bypassing the massive, chaotic mob of dismounted Tatars. When they finally emerge from the ravine, they are directly behind the enemy lines. For a brief, terrifying second, Vorotynsky looks out over the exposed backs of the greatest army in the world. The invincible Crimean Khanate is totally disorganized, packed together like desperate animals, furiously clawing at a wooden box. The Russian general draws his sword and orders the charge. The impact is apocalyptic. Thousands of armored Russian riders smash into the completely unprotected rear of the Tatar horde. The dismounted steppe warriors do not even have time to turn around before they are trampled under iron hooves or cleaved in half by heavy cavalry sabres. The shockwave of the charge ripples through the densely packed crowd, causing a sudden, paralyzing wave of pure terror. At that exact moment, Khvorostinin hears the thunder of the cavalry from behind the enemy lines. He orders the German mercenaries to load their cannons with double grapeshot. They fire one final, earth-shattering volley at point-blank range, completely vaporizing the front ranks of the attackers. Then the heavy iron chains of the gulyay gorod are unlocked. The wooden shields are violently pushed aside and the starving, desperate Russian infantry pours out of the fortress. The trap has snapped completely shut. The mighty Tatar army, the terror of Eastern Europe, is caught in a flawless, inescapable pincer movement. They are trapped between a wall of furious infantry pouring out of the wood and a tidal wave of heavy cavalry crushing them from behind. What follows is not military combat, it is an industrial extermination. The elite Ottoman janissaries and the proud Tatar nobility, men who have never known defeat, realize they are going to die in the mud. Panic, total and absolute, infects the horde. They break rank and try to run, but they are on foot, completely exhausted, and surrounded by men who have spent the last 5 days drinking mud and eating raw horse meat. The Russians do not take prisoners, they hack, stab, and bludgeon with the manic, relentless energy of men who have just returned from the grave. Devlet Giray, watching from a distant hill, sees his entire legacy evaporate in a matter of minutes. The man who had already divided up Russian cities as prizes of war is now watching his personal guard be butchered like cattle. He does not ride down to save them. He turns his horse and flees south, abandoning his sons, his generals, and his entire army to the meat grinder. The sun rises over the Pakra River on August 3rd, 1572, illuminating a landscape that has been fundamentally altered. The rolling green steppe is gone. In its place is a sprawling, horrific carpet of human and animal remains stretching for miles. Of the 120,000 men who marched north to erase Russia from the map, barely 20,000 will make it back to the Crimea alive. The invincible Ottoman janissaries have been completely wiped out. The elite Tatar nobility, the proud lords of the steppe, have been butchered in the mud by starving peasants and desperate mercenaries. The rivers are choked with so much blood and rotting flesh that the water will be undrinkable for months. The cleanup is a logistical nightmare. It takes weeks to burn the mountains of corpses, the thick black smoke replacing the dust clouds of the Tatar cavalry. This is the Battle of Molodi. It is not just a military victory, it is the violent birth of a superpower. Before this battle, the Russian state was a fragile, bleeding borderland, constantly terrified of the horsemen from the south. After Molodi, the psychological spine of the steppe empires is permanently broken. The Crimean Khanate will never again launch a full-scale invasion of Russia. They will never again burn Moscow. The balance of power on the Eurasian continent shifts overnight. When the news of the slaughter reaches the royal courts of Western Europe and the Sultan's palace in Istanbul, the reaction is utter shock. The obituary of the Russian Tsardom is hurriedly torn up. The foreign ambassadors realize that the freezing expanse to the east is no longer a dying animal. It is a terrifying new predator that has just tasted blood. The nomadic way of war, which had terrorized civilization since the days of Genghis Khan, has finally been dismantled by gunpowder, thick wood, and sheer, unadulterated desperation. Russia stops being the victim and begins its relentless, centuries-long expansion into an empire that will eventually span a sixth of the Earth's landmass. But dark history rarely rewards its true saviors. Prince Mikhail Vorotynsky, the scarred, crippled genius who built the wandering city and orchestrated the greatest tactical masterclass of the 16th century, does not get a happy ending. When the cowardly Tsar Ivan the Terrible returns from his hiding place in the north, he does not shower his general with gold or build him a monument. Ivan is a deeply paranoid tyrant. He looks at the man who just saved his kingdom, a man now adored by the surviving army, and he sees a terrifying rival. Just 1 year after the miracle at Molodi, Ivan falsely accuses Vorotynsky of treason. The Tsar strips the hero of Russia of his titles, straps him to a wooden stake, and burns him alive. The empire is saved, but the architect is turned to ash. When we look back at the 23,000 doomed men who held the line at Molodi, we are reminded of a brutal, uncomfortable historical truth. Empires are not built on justice, and they are not built on morality. They are built on the broken backs of desperate men who are handed impossible odds and ordered to die. Vorotynsky and his starving soldiers did not fight for glory, and they certainly did not fight for a Tsar who despised them. They fought for the simple, primal right to exist. They looked into the eyes of the apocalypse, dragged it into a wooden cage, and beat it to death with their bare hands. If you found value in this dark, forgotten story of survival, please help us conquer the algorithm by hitting that subscribe button and leaving a like. It truly helps the channel bring more of these incredible, historical, deep dives to life. And I have a question for you to answer in the comments below. Knowing the horrific fate that awaited Prince Vorotynsky at the hands of his own Tsar, do you think his ultimate sacrifice was worth it? Was saving the future of the Russian Empire worth the price of his own agonizing betrayal? Let me know what you think. Until next time, remember that the foundation of the modern world is buried in the mud, and we will keep digging it up